Welcome to the Unhealthy Policy Podcast, where we break down how policy decisions in Washington actually play out in our hospitals, clinics, and communities. Today's episode, we're going to dive deep into what the heck is going on with measles and what the heck is going on with our vaccine policy. I'm one of the co-hosts, Jake, and I'm here with David today. And the policy piece we're talking about today are comments made by RFK, by the current administration, and then enacted out in different policies as they relate to vaccines. David, as a quick icebreaker, when I was over at your apartment a couple weeks ago, there was all these cats running around. So if you had to name one of your cats after an infectious disease syndrome or bacteria or virus, what would you name your cat?
Okay, so to be clear, none of these are my cats. They're my upstairs roommate's cats who have free reign of my apartment. But if I had to, I think I would go with Cat Midia.
Cat Mania, I love it. I thought you were going to go Toxo, short for toxoplasmosis.
Yeah, you know me, Jake, a STI fan over here.
You are. So let's dive right into the episode. David, what is going on right now with measles in the United States?
There's been an outbreak that started in Texas and has mostly been located to that geographic region in America. And even though it started down in Texas, it is starting to spread around the country with different areas having cases crop up. And I think that there's a real risk that this outbreak spreads at a more national level rather than just a regional level. And we've seen what happens when respiratory diseases spread nationally. It's a real challenge to contain.
David, I think what's important about this outbreak is that the reason it's sustained is that in these communities, vaccine rates are lower than they need to get herd immunity. Usually cases in the United States are for an international traveler coming back to the United States and someone who's unvaccinated, and there's one or two cases. In this outbreak, there's over 350 cases, and 95% of those children who get this disease are unvaccinated. Remember, this was a disease that was eradicated in the United States in 2000. And in 2025, we have over 350 cases. And some people think that number is much, much higher because if you're not tested, then you may not report those cases. And what really concerns me about the current environment is there's been no policy, no coordinated effort at the national level to really respond to this outbreak.
Yeah, there's just been a lack of messaging around what is going on and what to do. And the Center for Disease Control, it's right there, the name is built to prevent outbreaks and to stop outbreaks like this. The Center for Disease Control has really been absent as far as leading a charge to contain and stop this. That is a failure of policy response that is actually literally killing children.
David, you're right. Children have died. The last report showed that 2 kids had died in the United States from measles. This is unheard of. Of those who got measles, 95% of the children were unvaccinated. Vaccines work and have prevented disease, and that really should be a pillar of our response. Unfortunately, there's been no unified response by the government to try to get ahead of this outbreak.
So are there specific policies that we're going to address, or are we kind of talking about administrative vibes and how those play out?
The policy pieces we're really talking about today are the policies that are cutting vaccine research, in particular vaccine uptake. There's been cancellations of vaccine meetings, for example, to determine what the next flu vaccine is going to look like. And also, as you talked about, the vibes around vaccines and whether they are beneficial or potentially harmful. So we're going to dive into that today.
Yeah, and unfortunately, vibes around vaccines are an important predictor of uptake by people, which directly goes to save lives. And I think it's worth having an understanding of what vaccines are and how they're used and how they've been used historically. Just quickly, what are vaccines? Vaccines are where you take a small piece of a pathogen. There are a variety of different types of pathogens. And essentially, you introduce that into the body, and it trains your immune system to respond to that pathogen. And so instead of having that pathogen interact with your immune system for the first time, when that pathogen actually gets in your body, you have your immune system already pre-trained with some weapons that it can fight that pathogen when it shows up for the first time.
David, what's your favorite vaccine analogy? Like, explain it like I'm 5 years old.
Yeah, Jake, you are kind of dumb. Your immune system in some ways is kind of like a Marvel cast of heroes. There are a bunch of different players that are working together to fight a bunch of different enemies, but in this case, a common enemy. And so say you've got the Green Goblin and he's attacking you. You can either be attacked by the Green Goblin without any knowledge of what his kind of skills and weapons and methodologies are for getting in and messing up Wonder Woman or whatever. Or you can have a little bit of foreknowledge about what his weaknesses are and what kind of weapons he has at his disposal. And you can prepare around that. And that just makes it a lot easier for your Marvel superheroes to fight him. It is very similar, honestly, to how the immune system works. And when you have knowledge about these pathogens, all the different components of your immune system work together with that pre-training to really fight off those pathogens based on what those pathogens are without a surprise attack.
So people probably don't know this, but David was my fellow when he was a trainee. And I used to ask him all these different types of questions when he was at clinic. So, David, I have a question for you, a trivia question. Who was the first US president to endorse vaccines or at least comment on the benefit of vaccines?
Wow. I would guess that it was somebody back in the early days around smallpox. Smallpox vaccines came out in like the Cotton Mather era. George Washington.
Close. Thomas
Thomas
Jefferson.
Jefferson. Oh, shit.
In 1806, Thomas Jefferson wrote to the inventor of the smallpox vaccine, Edward Jenner, and I quote, "You have erased from the calendar of human afflictions one of its greatest." He goes on to say, "Further nations will know by history only that the loathsome smallpox has existed and by you has been extirpated." Thomas Jefferson. I don't want to make this a history podcast, but I think the history of vaccines is very important to talk about briefly. So you're right. Smallpox was the very first vaccine that was developed. And it turned out that Dr. Jenner tried to infect people with a similar virus called cowpox. And when they were infected by cowpox, the disease was very, very mild, and it prevented smallpox. So the idea was you give somebody something that's less lethal, their immune system, the cast of Marvel characters, learns about that particular pathogen. And then when they see it in the wild, they can then kill it.
Even before Edward Jenner came up with that cowpox idea, different people around the world had been using a method where they introduced small amounts of smallpox into the skin in kind of a non-lethal fashion. And that would train the immune system and prevent severe infection. So actually, we've been using some type of vaccine analogous technology for literally thousands of years. And then it's kind of really taken hold and become an area of science since Edward Jenner invented the cowpox vaccine.
And David, do you speak Latin?
I do not speak Latin.
Do you speak Spanish?
I do speak Spanish.
What is cow in Spanish?
Vaca.
Where do you think the word vaccine came from?
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
So the
That's
Latin,
good.
the Latin of cow is very similar, vaca, and that's where vaccines came from. The name is honoring that first cowpox vaccine that prevented smallpox.
Nice. Fun facts, Jake.
I'm all full of fun facts today.
Okay, and just a few more facts, and then we'll dive into the current policy. But I think it is worth just at least mentioning what vaccines have done for the world and how they've kind of bent the curve of global mortality. So, Jake, do you have any facts and figures in a fact mode?
I love facts. David, it's fantastic. If you look across the thousands of years of human history, and this actually relates even to our most similar primates, about 50% of kids die before they finish puberty. And that was true up 1600s, 1700s. You could look at ancient Rome. You can look at even more modern civilizations in the 1500s and 1600s. 50% of kids died. In the early 19th century and into the 20th century, that rate started to drop. And a lot of that was due to science around clean water, nutrition, and things like that. But around 1950, it was still about a quarter of kids who were born ended up dying before puberty. And that was really when the vaccine era started. And it's been estimated that vaccines globally have saved over 190 million lives. And now that childhood mortality has dropped to much less than 1% here in the United States, and globally is probably around 3 or 4%. And vaccines are a large portion of why that is so low now. What's your favorite vaccine stat?
One thing that I learned yesterday, actually, in a course I'm taking, is that the global campaign to actually vaccinate the world didn't really start until the 1970s. And so the global effort to address a lot of these vaccine preventable diseases hadn't even started until midway through my parents' lifetimes. That is a very surprising thing that this is a new phenomenon that we're even addressing at the global scale.
And David, it's like fun not to be sick all the time. I mean,
Yeah,
even if you survived smallpox or measles, like, heck, I'd rather not have it.
for sure. I mean, smallpox we eradicated, which is obviously incredible. Smallpox was a wildly disfiguring, highly lethal disease, and now it's gone.
I mean, just what a huge success for modern medicine that we eradicated an entire disease through vaccination.
Yeah.
Everyone used to get the smallpox vaccine. David and I were born in the 80s. We didn't have to get the smallpox vaccine because that disease does not exist anymore. I think this shows the power that vaccines have had over the course of human history.
And one of the vaccines that has saved the most lives is actually measles. It's estimated to have saved over 90 million lives. So that is kind of our biggest mortality gain is from the measles vaccine itself and preventing measles in childhood. I am seeing a patient who has had seizures for his entire life. He's kind of late middle age, but he's had seizures his entire life because measles got into his brain and caused a bunch of inflammation when he was a kid. And he's suffering from those consequences today. So even though this is something that's quite rare in the modern era, some folks born before the modern vaccination efforts, they still are suffering from the consequences of having some of these childhood diseases that now we just really never see.
The other example that I always am reminded of is Mitch McConnell
Mm.
had polio as a kid. And we still see folks who are in those iron lungs, those kind of breathing machines, who had polio in the 1940s and 50s. And that disease just doesn't exist anymore, especially here in the United States and even globally. And that's just another success of vaccines. So, David, to your point about measles making a comeback here in the United States, as infectious disease doctors, we get text messages all the time from family and friends who are worried. I remember during COVID, I realized that we were in trouble in late February when I started getting floods of texts. And I think I knew that what was being reported may not have captured what was happening on the ground. So I received this text about a week ago. It was from a family member who I'm fairly close with. And it said, "We have a student who has been diagnosed with measles. She had her first vaccine shot, although not the second. And he was wondering what the next appropriate steps were. He works in a school and was very worried about the other classmates, the teachers. And I advised him, obviously, to work with his local public health department."
And just 2 seconds on measles itself. It is the most infectious virus that we know. So it spreads faster and easier than any other virus. A full dose of the vaccine typically gives you lifelong immunity from it. And if you have measles, oftentimes people, they fully recover and do fine. But there are a lot of cases where it can get into the brain of children and adults who don't have immunity from it and cause severe disease, what we call encephalitis, and death. So even if a small percentage of people suffer those consequences, because it infects so many people and it's so infectious, it can cause widespread mortality as a result.
Yeah, David, do you want to talk a little bit about herd immunity? I feel like that term is thrown out a lot and different definitions are used.
So herd immunity or community immunity, which I like better because it sounds like a song and dance duo, is the percentage of people that need to be immune either through vaccination or through natural immunity from acquiring the disease in order for the epidemic to stop propagating. That depends on how infectious the disease is. So for measles, over 94% of the community has to have some type of immune status in order for the disease to stop propagating.
Yeah, and David, you mentioned earlier for each individual who has measles, they spread it on average to around 15 other people in a completely unvaccinated community. So that's where that 94% comes from. And one dose of the vaccine protects about 90 to 93% of people. Once you get that second dose, which is the current recommendation, it gets up to about 97 to 99%. So really, that's the amount of vaccine and, like you said, natural disease that has to happen in a community for it to stop spreading. And the reason I think that's really important is there are some people who cannot get the vaccine or who may not respond to the vaccine. And I'm thinking about folks who have had cancer and maybe on chemotherapy, who maybe needed a transplant. So when I think about getting a vaccine, I'm, yes, protecting myself, but I also am protecting my neighbor my kids' classmates who may be immunosuppressed. I'm protecting the pregnant school teacher. So there's a lot more than just the individual benefit to a lot of these vaccines.
Protecting people who have autoimmune disorders and are on immunosuppressive medications. There are a lot of people in the community at large who are at risk for these infections, even if they have tried to get the vaccine. So it is important not only to protect yourself, but also I think to do your part to protect the community that you're a part of. So now that we've learned a little bit more about what vaccines are and kind of some of the history around them and measles as a disease, can you tell us a little bit about the policy pieces that we're addressing today?
In my mind, there's really three different policy pieces. The first is the cancellation of certain vaccine meetings and then vaccine advisory groups. In particular, the flu vaccine advisory group, which meets every year to decide what's going to be in the seasonal flu vaccine. That meeting was canceled, or I should say, delayed. The second policy piece is specific cuts to research around vaccines, including mRNA vaccines, vaccine uptake, and other kind of basic science research that leads to these vaccines. And then third, I really put in the vibes category. And what I mean by this is comments by RFK and others questioning the efficacy and safety of vaccines, comments about kind of this personal choice. And it's a personal choice whether or not to get a vaccine. And that's been a real shift away from historically, the guidance has been yes, get the measles vaccine, yes, get the polio vaccine. And part of that reason is for this herd immunity. And additionally, promoting non evidence based treatment methods for measles as opposed to really focusing on the vaccine efforts.
Jake, to your third point, what are some of the treatment options that they've been promoting and how have those had an effect or not?
Great. So, for most of American history, during outbreaks, when a vaccine was available, the primary way to stop the spread of a disease is to vaccinate people who are in the community. You can even vaccinate people after they were exposed. In the current outbreak, this administration is promoting a couple non evidence based therapies, in particular, vitamin A. So, we do know in measles, for kids who may not have the best nutrition, vitamin A probably helps a little bit and can prevent some of the eye complications. So I think with a lot of this, it's based on a little bit of truth, but then expanded to other areas where it doesn't really make sense. In West Texas, where the outbreak is happening, most of those kids have access to food and are very kind of nutritionally robust. And in that setting, there's very little evidence that vitamin A helps. And in fact, vitamin A in high quantities can be toxic. And what RFK has suggested is taking cod liver oil, and liver in general has very high levels of vitamin A. So this is basically treatment with vitamin A. So there have been cases in Texas of parents treating their kids with high doses of vitamin A, and then those kids getting liver damage. David, one thing I've heard some parents think about is hosting a measles party. Actually, back in the 1980s and 90s, we used to do this with chickenpox. And the idea back then, before there was a vaccine, is that if you get chickenpox when you're young, it's less severe, you'll get immune and you'll be fine. So I remember going over to my friend's house to play Nintendo and getting chickenpox from them. What do you think in 2025 about hosting measles parties?
Well, Jake, you know me. I typically support a party.
That is true.
But there are exceptions to every rule. And I think this is a bad idea. There are better options, and that is a vaccine, honestly. The measles, as we mentioned, can have some severe negative consequences. Death, there have definitely been deaths already in this current outbreak. And then long-term consequences if the measles causes some damage to the body, especially to the brain, that people live with for their entire lives, even if they survive the illness. So it's not a benign thing to get measles, quite the opposite.
Yeah, back before we had vaccines, 1 in 5 children who got measles were hospitalized. Just think of the economic cost of that. And two, to your point, about 1 in 1,000 kids die who get the measles, which might not sound like a lot, but if every single kid in the United States got measles, that's thousands of deaths a year. One of my favorite statistics about the measles vaccine is that it actually protects you from more than just the measles. And the reason this happens is that measles infects a particular immune cell and can actually reset your immune system. So in the 1950s and 60s, before the vaccines, even if the patient survived measles, it often would make them more susceptible to diseases they already had. Whereas the measles vaccine does not reset the immune system and, in fact, protects you from measles and maintains all that immunity to the other childhood diseases.
One thing I just want to address is how these policies either help or hurt us as Americans. And by these policies, I mean efforts to deprioritize vaccine research, canceling vaccine meetings where scientists determine how to formulate the vaccines at the national level, and then switching from using vaccines as a preventative approach for disease to treatment, unproven treatment methods for people who get the disease because they aren't vaccinated. And I think across the board, this hurts Americans. This harms Americans because not only do we not have a coordinated national strategy for preventing disease, we also are having much more disease within our population. And inevitably, that's going to lead to more harm, more deaths, as we've seen, and more difficulty in containing the current outbreak and preventing future outbreaks, which have massive economic and health related impacts for average Americans, mostly for children who, again, have no say in whether or not they get these diseases.
I think that's what really sticks with me is that at the end of the day, we're talking about kids. And the decades of research have really shown that these vaccines improve survival, help kids be healthy so they can focus on the things that they want to do. So we talked about the measles outbreak, how vaccines are effective and how vaccines saved lives. One of the reasons that we got into this situation with increased measles circulation is due to decreasing vaccine uptake in some of our communities. And I think it's really important to address some vaccine hesitancy, to talk about some of the real risks, actual risks of vaccines, to better understand why this is happening in our communities.
Yeah, and Jake, I think we should do a separate episode that's entirely devoted to vaccines as a technology. But it's totally understandable for people to be hesitant about putting a vaccine in their body. It's something that you're injecting, but it's a foreign piece of material that you're adding to your body to prevent a disease that you don't already have. That is a leap of faith in some ways. And in the modern era, we've come a long way. But even still, there are rare instances where vaccines do cause harm. And I think minimizing that and not addressing it is doing a disservice to people who are concerned about using vaccines.
Let's be honest, David, physicians have made mistakes over the course of history. And I think for anybody who's putting something into their body, they want to be assured that it is safe. I think one of the frequent comments I hear from people is, yes, in the 1950s, there was a ton of measles. In 2025, there's some measles, but it's still pretty rare. So if I was living in 1950, I would get the vaccine because I know it prevents disease. But in 2025, what's the chance that I'm actually going to be exposed to measles? So because that risk is much lower now, I do think we owe it to people who are receiving these vaccines to make sure they are extremely, extremely safe.
Just to comment on the safety of vaccines, it's not that they never have side effects. Every medication that we use, every technology that we use has unintended side effects, and vaccines are no exception to that. There are certainly immediate effects of fever and feeling ill, although I don't think of that as a side effect per se. That's really the body responding to the vaccine as you would want it to develop the immune response. There are multiple different avenues for both monitoring vaccine side effects and also for compensating people who do have proven vaccine related harm. So there's, of course, a bunch of monitoring and testing prior to their general release to the public. Once they're cleared for use by the FDA, we have this thing called VAERS, which is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, where people can report any sort of vaccine related harms they think they might have had. Anybody can report to that. And then those harms are aggregated and trended and monitored.
Yeah, David, I think for the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, which is called MMR, you mentioned sore arm, fevers. I agree with you. I don't really consider those severe side effects as your immune system responding to it. There are some very rare side effects. So a couple per 100,000 of children will have what's called febrile seizure, which usually is self-limited and the kids recover, but that is something to know about. And one of the things we worry about a lot is since MMR is a live vaccine, meaning it's the actual virus that can replicate, but much, 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 much weaker, is that could you get a syndrome that's similar to measles? And it turns out that it's extremely, extremely rare. And in fact, only 3 reported cases in human history about measles going to the brain after the vaccination. So think of all those hundreds of thousands, millions of children that got vaccinated. Only 3 cases of the measles encephalitis is what it's called. There are some people who really can't receive live vaccines. We talked a little bit earlier about the child who may have leukemia and is getting a bone marrow transplant, the patient who had their liver transplant or is on immunosuppression. Those folks cannot safely get some of these live vaccines because of that risk of the virus causing the actual disease. And the measles vaccine, yes, it's a live vaccine, but it's very safe, been used millions and millions of times. So, David, can you comment a little bit about what is available to the public if they have one of these very, very rare side effects?
Yes, we have this thing called the vaccine court. And the actual name for it is the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And what it is a legal system that is set up by the US where if people have proven vaccine related harm, they can be compensated for it. And it's done through an independent fund that was set up by the US. And the reason for that is so that we can give these vaccines and also have a mechanism in place to ensure that people who have any sort of vaccine related harm are compensated for it. In the scheme of how many millions of doses, really billions of doses of vaccines are given out, the number of vaccine related harm is quite low.
David, I do want to talk about the vaccine reporting system that you mentioned earlier. I think a really key example is if you remember during COVID, there was a specific vaccine that actually caused a lot of blood clots and low platelets. And it was identified very early by this nationwide system and actually taken off the market. So when a vaccine has some unexpected side effects that maybe weren't seen in the clinical trials, there's this mechanism to really take it off the market and figure out what is the best path for Americans. David, I have 2 kids, as you know, and my oldest is 3.5. So she received the first dose of the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. And my son is about to get his first dose here in the next couple of months. And one thing we've all read about and has really been in the background of a lot of these discussions is the now debunked link between autism and the MMR vaccine. But I think some historical context here is really important. What did those studies in the late 1990s show? What do we know now about the science?
It's a really tragic story because I think it's done an incredible amount of harm. In the late 90s, this doctor named Andrew Wakefield, an English doctor, published a paper in The Lancet linking MMR vaccines to a combination of enterocolitis, inflammation of the intestines, and a developmental disorder with the MMR vaccine. Importantly, this study suffered from a bunch of methodologic issues. It was done on only 12 patients, which is just an incredibly low number.
Right. How many patients are usually in these vaccine trials?
Yeah, the vaccine trials typically have tens of thousands of patients involved. And this study wasn't a vaccine trial, but it had a very small number of patients at the beginning. And importantly, beyond the methodologic failures, it was actually found that there was overt fraud and wild conflicts of interest from the beginning. Andrew Wakefield, before even recruiting the children to be a part of the study, he was getting paid by a law firm that was trying to start a class action lawsuit about the harms from vaccines. So before he even really embarked on this study, he was being paid to find the results he found. And then beyond that, he advocated that instead of giving the MMR as a 3 vaccine combination, he advocated for single vaccine dosing. So in this case, it'd be just the measles vaccine. And it turns out he had a financial stake in that single measles vaccine.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, David, 12 patients, falsified data, so potentially he'd have some financial incentive, really is what this started as.
Yeah, and it's had an incredible amount of harm as it's taken hold for some anti-vaccine advocacy groups. Been something that has led to a lot of children not getting the MMR vaccine and potentially not getting other vaccines as well. It's really hard to calculate how much damage this has caused.
And David, I think both of us sitting here today, if there was actually a link between autism or we knew something that caused autism, I think we would be the first people to say, yes, we shouldn't be doing that, or we should be trying to research these issues because autism is a real issue. And what the current president has said during his State of the Union is that autism rates have increased over the past 20 years, which is true. There is more autism, or at least autism is being diagnosed more. So we're not minimizing autism here, but I think really understanding the science is important.
Yeah, Jake, and there has been a lot of additional investigation into whether there is a link. This was brought up, and so scientists went out and tried to figure out if this was a real link or not. And what are some of the big studies that resulted from that investigation?
I'm just going to highlight one of many studies. This was a study that was done on nearly 1 million Danish children. So, really, every child in Denmark was part of this study. And it looked at the risk of autism after receiving MMR vaccine and also included children who didn't get the MMR vaccine. And there was absolutely no link between autism and the MMR vaccine. There was no clustering of diagnosis of autism right after getting the MMR vaccine. Even in individuals who were thought to be at high risk for autism, so a strong family history, those children were not more likely to get autism after getting the MMR vaccine. The other story we have to tell is what happened in Japan and the MMR vaccine. So in the late 80s, the Japanese government introduced a measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine that was different than the one used in the United States. It used a different form of the mumps vaccine. And it turned out that this particular strain of the mumps vaccine had a lot of side effects. So it was removed. And instead, the measles and the rubella, as separate individual shots, were given to the people of Japan. So what happened? Well, not surprisingly, measles and rubella were very much under control. However, rubella spread like wildfire. Every few years, there would be outbreaks throughout Japan. But what happened to autism? What happened to any neurodevelopmental issues? So remember, Wakefield thought it was the combination MMR that caused autism. Autism rates in Japan increased at the exact same rate as they did worldwide, where other countries were receiving the MMR vaccine. And to this day, there is no mumps vaccine that is given universally around Japan. My takeaway from this story is that whether the fear is from a real side effect or from fraudulent data, it has long-lasting impacts. So I think very clearly in 2025, we can all sit here and say very confidently that the MMR vaccine does not increase the risk of autism. David, it's time for my favorite segment. Is it healthy or unhealthy policy? This is the segment where we
Ugh.
go around and talk about one or two aspects that really stuck with us during the episode and determine whether the policies are healthy or unhealthy.
Yeah, for me, Jake, it's the lives saved from vaccines. So specifically, measles is estimated to have saved over 90 million lives. And that's just lives saved. As I mentioned, I had that patient who had lifelong seizures as a result of his measles infection as a kid. And so who knows how many more millions of people would have those kind of complications as a result of their childhood infections that don't. But 90 million lives saved is a shockingly high number and a pretty incredible fact about the benefits of the measles vaccine.
So the policy is
Yes, Jake. So the policy, I would say, to deprioritize research into this and to deprioritize vaccines as a public health measure is pretty unhealthy. Pretty unhealthy.
I have two, David. First, destroying this pipeline of research that's going to lead to safer and more effective vaccines for current diseases and diseases of the future. It's one of our best tools that we have to let Americans, to let the population really do other things. No one wants to be thinking about measles. No one wants to be thinking about disease. I think having these vaccines is the number one tool that we can use. The second is this vibes question, this make America healthy again. When are we going back to? Are we going back to the 1750s when we had no vaccines and 50% of kids were dying? Are we going back to the 1950s when people were getting measles and resetting their immune system?
Or getting polio and being in iron lungs.
Yeah, that is not making America healthy again. That's making America unhealthy again. The other aspect that really worries me about this policy is the narrative that treating these diseases is equivalent to preventing these diseases. I hope we can all agree we'd rather not have a disease, even if we end up treating it, for all the reasons that we talked about. And for that reason, these vibes are an unhealthy policy.
So unhealthy policy all around.
3 for 3. We only have 2 for 2. We only have 2 for us. Wilfredo could have joined us today, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah. 3 for 3 on the pillars of unhealthy policy. 2 for 2 on the podcast hosts.
One day we'll have a healthy policy. I know it. David, it is time for your favorite segment.
Oh, I love it.
And it is the DDCU segment. So David, what is a DDCU?
Oh yeah, the Dunkin' Donuts coffee unit, or the number of small cups of black coffee that each American has to give up to pay for a policy per year.
In the prior episode, we discussed DDCUs as it related to the cost of 1 cup of coffee for how much these cuts were going to be saving America. Vaccines are interesting because it turns out giving vaccines actually saves money. So it's a reverse DDCU.
The reverse
And
DDCU.
The reverse DDCU.
Oh, hot damn. Wait, are you saying you're going to put cups of coffee in my hand?
Yeah, David, we're giving Americans free coffees.
Oh, all right.
Vaccines are cost saving because they prevent illness, they prevent hospitalizations. We call that direct care costs. Over the past 30 years, America has saved $540 billion in direct care costs, which is equivalent to about $18 billion per year. So that's fewer hospitalizations, fewer medications to treat these diseases. So how many DDCUs is that, David?
Jake, I don't do mental math. That's more coffee than I think I want to drink in the moment, but that's a lot of coffee back in my hand. I'll say that much.
I'm going to say it's about 18 cups of coffee per
so.
year. So if we get rid of vaccines, everybody has to give up 18 cups of coffee. Whereas if we give everyone vaccines, everybody gets 18 free cups of coffee, which I think is a great benefit.
I'll take it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining for our second episode of the Unhealthy Podcast. I'm Jake. I don't have measles.
I'm David. I also don't have measles, thankfully. For now.
Thanks, everybody.
For now.
For now. Oh, we forgot about the measles on the train.
A guy from Boston went down to New York, measles on a train. The next installation, the snakes on a plane update.
Series. Yeah, the snakes on a plane. Measles on a train.
Oh, it's getting bad out there. All right.
All right.
Thanks everybody.
David.